Long ago, in a corner of the city where the pavement was cracked and the street lamps flickered like dying stars, there was a tiny shop called the Roasted Bean. It was a humble place, smelling of toasted hazelnut and old books. Working there was a young woman named Elara. She was as gentle as the first breath of spring, with eyes that saw the beauty in everyone, even the broken. Elara lived a simple life in a small apartment with thin walls and a heart full of hope. She believed that kindness was a currency that never lost its value. Every morning, she wiped the counters and greeted the regulars with a smile that could thaw the coldest winter. She didn't have much, just her integrity and a dream of one day painting the world in brighter colors. But Oakhaven was a predator, always hungry for the innocent. Little did Elara know, her quiet life was about to be interrupted by a man whose very name made the powerful tremble in their silk robes. One rainy Tuesday, the heavy silence of the afternoon was broken by the chime of the door. In walked a man who seemed to pull the very shadows in with him. He wore a suit as black as a raven's wing, tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. His hair was slicked back, and his face was carved from cold marble, but it was his eyes that stopped Elara's breath. They were sharp, dark, and filled with a terrifying stillness. This was Kenji Sato. In the underworld, they called him the Iron Ghost, the silent king of the Sato Syndicate. He didn't speak. He simply sat in the far corner, his presence heavy and suffocating. Elara felt a shiver run down her spine, a primal warning that a wolf had entered her sanctuary. Yet, true to her nature, she didn't flinch. She approached him with a steady hand, placing a menu on the table. He didn't look at it. He only looked at her. For 10 minutes he sat in absolute silence, watching her move. He saw the way she helped an elderly man with his coat and the way she hummed to herself while grinding beans. To a man who dealt only in betrayal and blood, her genuine light was an anomaly. He left a $100 bill for a $3 coffee and vanished into the rain. For an entire week, the ritual continued. At precisely 4 o'clock, the black sedan would pull up and the Iron Ghost would emerge. He always sat in the same cracked leather chair, and he always ordered black coffee. No sugar, no cream, just the bitter heat. Elara began to notice things others missed. She saw the tension in his broad shoulders, the way his hand reflexively moved toward his jacket when the door opened too quickly, and the deep, hidden exhaustion in his gaze. He wasn't just a man of power, he was a man who lived in a cage of his own making. One day, a group of local debt collectors entered the shop, looking to harass the owner, Mr. Henderson. They were loud, crude men who took pleasure in breaking things. When one of them grabbed Elara's wrist, demanding she be nicer to them, the air in the room suddenly turned freezing. Kenji Sato didn't stand up. He didn't shout. He simply tapped his gold ring on the table. The sound was like a gunshot in the small room. The collectors turned, their faces draining of color the moment they saw the man in the corner. Without a single word being exchanged, they scrambled out of the shop, nearly tripping over their own feet in their haste to escape. Elara stood behind the counter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at Kenji, expecting him to say something, but he merely took a slow sip of his coffee. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Kenji set his cup down with a soft click that echoed through the empty shop. He looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face as if looking for a secret. "This place is a ruin," he said, his voice deep and smooth like expensive silk. It was the first time she had heard him speak, and the sound made her skin prickle. "It's my home," Elara defended softly, tilting her chin up. Kenji stood, his towering frame casting a long, intimidating shadow over her. "Home is a luxury the weak cannot afford in Oakhaven," he replied coldly. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the brass handle. "You have a name, waitress?" She hesitated before answering. Elara. He repeated it once, tasting the syllables as if they were a foreign delicacy. Elara, a name for a star. Then he was gone. That night, Elara couldn't sleep. The way he said her name felt like a mark, a claim laid upon her soul. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a great cliff, and the wind was starting to blow. The following morning, the world changed. When Elara arrived at the Roasted Bean, she found the front door locked and a closed sign hanging crookedly. Inside, her boss, Mr. Henderson, was sobbing into a handkerchief, surrounded by boxes. "What happened? Are we being evicted?" she cried, rushing to him. Henderson shook his head, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "No, Elara, we've been bought out. Someone paid a fortune. They paid off all my debts, gave me enough to retire in the islands, and bought the building, the land, and every bean in the cellar." Just then, the back door opened, and Kenji Sato stepped out, looking perfectly at home in the cramped office. He wasn't wearing his jacket today. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, revealing tattoos of dragons that seemed to writhe on his forearms. "Mr. Henderson is leaving," Kenji stated calmly. "As of 8 o'clock this morning, I am the sole owner of this establishment." Elara felt the floor tilt beneath her. "You bought a coffee shop? Why? You don't even like sugar." Kenji walked toward her, stopping only when he was inches away. The scent of sandalwood and expensive tobacco enveloped her. "I didn't buy a shop, Elara. I bought your time. From today, you work for me. Only me." "I quit," Elara said, her voice shaking but her eyes fierce. She turned to grab her bag, but Kenji's hand shot out, gripping the counter beside her, effectively trapping her. "You cannot quit a debt you didn't know you owed," he said softly. He pulled a thick folder from the counter and opened it. Inside were medical records, bank statements, and tuition bills. Elara gasped. They were her family's records. "Your father's heart surgery? Paid in full. Your brother's debt to the gambling dens? Wiped clean. Your mother's nursing home? Moved to the best facility in the country." Elara felt a wave of nausea. He hadn't just bought the shop, he had bought her entire life. He had dismantled the walls of her world and rebuilt them with his own money. "Why would you do this?" she choked out, tears stinging her eyes. Kenji reached out, his bum catching a stray tear before it could fall. His touch was surprisingly warm, a stark contrast to his cold demeanor. "Because in my world, everything is for sale, but nothing is true. You are the only thing in this city that isn't a lie. I want that truth near me. You will serve me here, in this shop, every day. You will be my sanctuary, and in return, your family will never know a day of want again." It was a golden cage, and the door had been slammed shut. Elara had no choice but to sign the contract he placed before her. Over the next week, the Roasted Bean was transformed. The peeling wallpaper was replaced with dark mahogany panels, and the old espresso machine was swapped for a custom-built silver beast from Italy. The shop remained closed to the public. The windows were tinted so no one could see inside. Elara spent her days in a beautiful, silent prison. Her only task was to be there whenever Kenji arrived. Sometimes he came in the morning, smelling of the crisp ocean air. Other times he arrived in the dead of night, his suit stained with dirt and his knuckles bruised. She would brew his coffee exactly the way he liked it and sit across from him. He didn't demand she speak, but he listened with an intensity that was almost painful when she did. She told him about her paintings, about the flowers she loved, and about the way the light hit the Oak Haven Bridge at sunset. Kenji would sit in silence, his sharp features softening just a fraction, as if her words were a balm for a wound he couldn't describe. But she never forgot who he was. She saw the guards outside, and the way the city whispered his name in fear. The peace of their strange arrangement was shattered on a night when the rain turned to ice. Kenji arrived later than usual, his movements heavy and uncoordinated. When he sat down, Elara noticed a dark stain spreading across the white silk of his shirt. She gasped, realizing it was blood. "You're hurt," she cried, rushing for the first aid kit she kept behind the counter. Kenji tried to wave her away, but his strength failed him. "It's nothing," he grunted, but his face was the color of ash. Elara ignored him, her hands steady as she began to cut away his shirt. The wound was a jagged gash across his ribs, angry and deep. As she cleaned the injury, Kenji watched her, his eyes clouded with pain. "Why aren't you afraid?" he asked, his voice a rasping whisper. "Most people would let me bleed out." Elara didn't look up. "I'm a waitress, Kenji. I've spent my life taking care of people. And besides, I can't serve a dead man, can I?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. In that moment, the iron ghost vanished, leaving only a man who was hurting and alone. Elara realized then that her kindness wasn't just a trait, it was a weapon. It was the only thing that could pierce the armor of the most dangerous man in Oakhaven. As the wound healed, something shifted between them. The air in the shop no longer felt like a cage, it felt like a shared secret. Kenji began to bring her gifts, not just jewelry or dresses, but things that showed he was truly listening. He brought her professional-grade oil paints from Paris, a rare book on Renaissance art, and even a small rosebush that somehow survived in the dim light of the shop. One afternoon, while the rain drummed a rhythmic beat on the roof, Kenji asked her to paint him. Elara hesitated, her brush hovering over the canvas. "I don't paint monsters," she said softly. Kenji leaned back, the shadows of the room playing across his face. "Then paint the man who bought a coffee shop just to hear a girl hum while she works." Elara looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the boy who had been forced to grow up too fast in a world of wolves. She began to paint. Hours passed in a comfortable silence, broken only by the scratching of the brush and the hum of the refrigerator. When she finished, Kenji stood up to look. The portrait wasn't a mafia boss. It was a man sitting in the light of a single window, looking towards something he couldn't quite reach. Kenji stared at it for a long time, his hand trembling slightly as he touched the canvas. "You see too much, Elara," he whispered. But the world outside didn't care about portraits or shared silences. A rival syndicate, the Iron Vipers, had grown tired of Kenji's dominance. They had noticed his frequent visits to the closed shop and deduced that the Iron Ghost had finally found a weakness. One evening, while Kenji was away at a meeting with the city officials, a black van screeched to a halt in front of the roasted bean. 3 men armed with crowbars smashed through the front door, the glass shattering like ice. Elara screamed, retreating behind the counter, but they were upon her in seconds. They didn't want the money in the till, they wanted a message. "So you're the one making the boss soft," the leader sneered, grabbing Elara by the hair and forcing her to look at the destruction. They began to smash the mahogany panels and the Italian espresso machine. They shredded her paintings and overturned the heavy tables. "Tell Sato the Vipers are coming for his head," the man hissed, pressing a cold knife to her cheek. Elara felt the sting of the blade and the heat of her own tears. She felt a surge of anger that outweighed her fear. "He will kill you for this," she said, her voice sounding like cold iron. The man laughed, but the laughter died in his throat as the sound of a high-powered engine roared outside. The front door didn't just open, it exploded off its hinges. Kenji Sato stood in the doorway, and for the first time, Elara saw the true meaning of his name. He didn't look like a man, he looked like a force of nature. His eyes were void of any human emotion, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. The Iron Vipers barely had time to raise their weapons. Kenji moved with a speed that defied logic, a blur of motion and violence. He didn't use a gun, he used his bare hands and the environment. He slammed one man's head into the counter and disarmed the leader with a sickening crack of bone. Within seconds, the intruders were broken on the floor. Kenji reached the man who held the knife and grabbed him by the throat, lifting him off the ground as if he weighed nothing. "You touched what is mine," Kenji roared, his voice shaking the very walls. He would have killed the man then and there if Elara hadn't reached out and touched his arm. "Kenji, stop, please!" He froze, the muscles in his neck bulging. He looked at Elara, at the blood on her cheek and the terror in her eyes, and the rage seemed to drain out of him, replaced by a devastating sorrow. He dropped the man and pulled Elara into his arms, holding her so tightly she could feel the frantic beating of his heart. The shop was a ruin once more, but Kenji refused to let her go. He moved her that night to his private estate, a sprawling fortress on the cliffs overlooking the sea. "You are not safe in the city," he told her, his voice back to its commanding tone, but his hands were still shaking. The estate was a place of impossible luxury, gardens that smelled of sea salt and jasmine, rooms filled with gold and silk, but to Elara it was just a bigger cage. She spent her days walking the perimeter, watched by silent men with earpieces. Kenji was gone for long hours, conducting a brutal purge of the iron vipers. When he returned, he was a ghost, haunted by the blood on his hands. He would find her in the garden and simply stand near her, needing her presence to remind him that he was still human. One night, Elara confronted him. "Is this what you wanted, Kenji? To keep me like a prize in a vault?" Kenji looked out at the dark ocean. "I wanted to keep you safe. I wanted to keep the world from touching you." Elara stepped into his line of sight. "The world has already touched me, Kenji. You touched me. You can't protect me from life. You can only choose to live it with me or keep me as a prisoner of your fear." The tension within the Sato syndicate began to boil over. Many of Kenji's men, led by his ambitious lieutenant Hiro, felt that the boss had lost his edge. They saw his obsession with the waitress as a fatal flaw. Hiro began to gather loyalists in the shadows, planning a coup that would return the syndicate to its bloodiest roots. Elara could feel the shift in the air at the estate. The guards were no longer respectful. Their eyes were filled with a cold calculation. She tried to warn Kenji, but he was blinded by his own grief and the weight of his empire. One night, the silence of the estate was shattered by the sound of muffled gunfire. Elara woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of heavy footsteps in the hall. She didn't wait. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp and hid behind the door. When a man burst in, she swung with all her might, knocking him unconscious. She ran through the darkened corridors, her heart in her throat, until she reached Kenji's study. She found him surrounded, facing Hiro and 3 others. "The Iron Ghost has turned into a weeping widow. It's time for a real leader." Just as Hiro's finger tightened on the trigger, Elara threw the brass lamp through the glass door, the distraction giving Kenji the split second he needed to draw his hidden weapon. The room erupted in a chaos of lead and shattered glass. When the smoke cleared, Hiro lay dead, and Kenji was standing over him, his shirt soaked in blood. He had been hid, but he didn't seem to notice. He looked at Elara, who was standing in the doorway, her hands covered in dust and her nightgown torn. She had saved his life again. The realization seemed to break something deep inside him. He dropped his gun and fell to his knees, not from the wound, but from the weight of his own choices. "I have brought nothing but death to your door," he choked out. Elara ran to him, pressing her hands to his wound to stop the bleeding. "Then stop, Kenji, just stop." That night, as the sirens wailed in the distance, Kenji Sato made a choice that no mafia boss had ever made. He began the process of dismantling his empire. He turned over decades of evidence to the few clean officials left in Oakhaven. He liquidated his assets and set up trust funds for the families of his victims. He knew he was signing his own death warrant, but for the first time in his life, he felt light. He was no longer the Iron Ghost. He was just a man trying to be worthy of a girl who made coffee with a smile. The transition was long and dangerous. Kenji and Elara were forced into hiding as the remnants of the underworld scrambled to claim the pieces of the Sato Empire. They moved from safe house to safe house, living out of suitcases and sleeping in shifts. But in the midst of the danger, they found a strange kind of happiness. They talked for hours about things that had nothing to do with power. Kenji told her about his grandmother's cooking and the way the mountains looked in his ancestral home. Elara taught him how to sketch with charcoal and how to find the beauty in a simple piece of fruit. One evening, while hiding in a small cottage by the northern lakes, Kenji pulled a small, worn velvet box from his pocket. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant, with a single clear diamond. "I bought this years ago," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "before I knew what a monster I was. I thought I would never find a reason to give it to anyone, but you gave me back my soul, Elara. I have nothing left to offer you but a name that is hated and a life that is hunted. Will you have me?" Elara didn't hesitate. She took his hand and felt the weight of the ring, a weight that felt like freedom. They escaped the country on a cold October night, boarding a cargo ship bound for the Mediterranean. They left behind the fog of Oakhaven and the blood-stained streets of their past. They arrived in a small, sun-drenched village on the coast of Italy, where the air smelled of lemons and the sea was a brilliant, endless blue. With the last of their hidden funds, they bought a small, derelict building on the town square. Over the next year, they worked side by side to restore it. Kenji used his strength to move stone and timber, his hands becoming calloused from honest labor. Elara painted the walls in shades of terracotta and gold, filling the space with the light she had always carried. They called the new cafe L'Ancora, the anchor. On the day they opened, Kenji stood behind the counter, wearing a simple apron over a linen shirt. He looked at the sign and then at Elara. "The contract is over, isn't it?" he asked. Elara laughed, a sound that echoed beautifully off the stone walls. "No, Kenji, the contract has just begun. But this time, it's not for my time, it's for our lives." They served their first customer, a small local fisherman, and for the first time in his life, Kenji Sato felt the true meaning of peace. Years turned into a gentle rhythm of seasons. The people of the village grew to love the quiet couple at the cafe. They didn't know the man's past, only that he was a devoted husband who worked the garden with a silent intensity. They called Elara the Lady of the Light, because of the way she seemed to glow when she spoke to the children. Their life was simple, filled with the smell of roasting beans and the sound of the ocean. But the past is a persistent ghost. One afternoon, a man entered the cafe who didn't fit the village's slow pace. He was young, dressed in a sharp suit, and his eyes were filled with a familiar hunger. He sat in the corner and watched Kenji for an hour. Elara felt the old fear prickle her skin, but she didn't show it. She served the man his espresso with a steady hand. When he finished, he walked to the counter. "The Iron Ghost is a hard man to find," he whispered, his voice like a snake in the grass. Kenji didn't flinch. He slowly wiped the counter, his dark eyes meeting the man's. "That man died in Oakhaven a long time ago," Kenji replied calmly. "I am just a gardener now." The man looked at Elara and then back at Kenji. He saw the peace in the old soldier's eyes and the love in the woman's. He nodded slowly. "Then let the ghost rest," he said, and walked out into the sunlight. The threat passed, but it reminded them of how precious their time was. Kenji became even more focused on the small things, the way the morning light hit Elara's hair, the sound of her laughter, the perfect temperature of a cup of coffee. He began to write, filling notebooks with his thoughts and memories, a way to purge the last of the shadows. Elara continued to paint, her work becoming famous in the region. She painted the village, the sea, and always, in some small way, the man who had bought a coffee shop to find his heart. They were happy, truly happy, in a way that few people ever get to be. They had faced the monster and won, not with guns or gold, but with the simple, radical act of choosing to be good. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their small apartment above the cafe, Kenji took Elara's hand. "I used to think that power was the ability to take whatever I wanted," he said, looking at the stars. "But I was wrong. True power is the ability to give everything away for the person you love." Elara leaned her head against his shoulder. "And true service is doing it every day, forever." The village children would often gather around Elara's table in the afternoons, and she would tell them stories. She told them of a great dragon who lived in a cave of gold, but was miserable because he had no one to share it with. She told them of a small bird who wasn't afraid of the dragon and who taught him how to fly in the sunlight. The children didn't know she was telling them her own story, but they felt the truth of it in their bones. Kenji would listen from the kitchen, a small smile on his face as he prepared the evening's meal. He had become the man Elara always knew he could be, a man of depth and kindness, whose strength was used to protect and provide, not to destroy. They had created a legacy that wasn't built on fear, but on the enduring power of a single kind act. The Iron Ghost was truly gone, replaced by a man who found his greatest joy in the simple act of serving a cup of coffee to the woman he loved. As the decades rolled by, the legend of Lancora grew. It became a place of pilgrimage for those who were lost or broken. People whispered that the coffee there had a way of clearing the mind, and that the woman who ran it could see into your soul. Elara and Kenji grew old together, their hair turning to silver like the Mediterranean moon. Their love didn't fade, it only deepened, becoming as solid and reliable as the stone walls of their cafe. One day, Elara found Kenji sitting in his garden, his eyes closed and a peaceful smile on his face. He had passed away quietly, surrounded by the roses he had tended so carefully. Elara didn't cry out in agony. She simply sat beside him and took his hand. She felt a profound sense of completion. They had fulfilled their contract. They had served each other until the very end. The village mourned the silent gardener, and the funeral was the largest the town had ever seen. Elara stood at the head of the procession, her face a mask of serene grace. She knew that he wasn't really gone. He was in every stone of the cafe, every brushstroke of her paintings, and every heart he had touched in his second life. Elara continued to run the cafe for several years after Kenji's passing. She was never truly alone, for she felt his presence in every corner of the shop. She would often sit in his favorite chair in the corner and watch the young couples who came in, hoping they would find even a fraction of the love she had known. One day, a young man from Oakhaven arrived, looking for the woman in the stories. He was a journalist, wanting to write about the Mafia queen who had vanished decades ago. Elara looked at him and laughed, the sound still bright and clear. "I was never a queen. I was a waitress who saw a man in the rain and decided not to be afraid." She refused to give him the sensational story he wanted. Instead, she gave him a cup of coffee and told him about the importance of kindness and the danger of power. "The Iron Ghost is a ghost for a reason," she said. "Let him stay in the shadows. Write about the man who grew roses instead." The journalist left, his notebooks empty, but his heart full. He never wrote the article. In her final years, Elara decided to return to Oakhaven one last time. She wanted to see the city where it all began, to see if the fog was still as gray and the lights as cold. She found that the city had moved on, but the corner where the roasted bean had once stood was now a small public park, filled with flowers and trees. In the center of the park was a statue of a woman holding a lamp, a gift from an anonymous donor years ago. Elara sat on a bench and watched the people go by. She saw a young girl help an old man with his coat, and she smiled. The light hadn't gone out, it had just spread. She felt a deep sense of peace. Her journey was almost over, and it had been a beautiful one. She had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and feared no evil, for she had a man by her side who had traded his crown for a heart. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the sun on her face, the same sun that had once shone on a rainy Tuesday in a tiny coffee shop. Elara passed away in her sleep shortly after her return to Italy. She was buried next to Kenji, under the shade of the lemon trees they had planted together. The café, Lancora, was left to the village, with the instruction that it always remain a place of sanctuary for those in need. The contract was finally, fully fulfilled. But as the old folks in the village like to say, the story doesn't end with a grave. They say that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the scent of jasmine is heavy, you can see two figures walking along the cliffs. One is a tall man in a dark suit, and the other is a woman with a lamp. They walk in silence, looking out at the sea, and wherever they pass, the shadows seem to draw back. It's a folk tale, of course, a legend told to keep the darkness at bay. But in a world that can often feel cold and cruel, it's a legend that people need to believe. It's a reminder that love is the ultimate power, and that even a mafia boss can be redeemed by the simple, enduring grace of a girl who refuses to give up on him.